I don't think I've ever seen such colors. Fulton turned to his companion. Aries Aston had her head craned back, a hand against the top of her hat to keep it from falling off, and looked positively dazzled. The expression was so pleasantly uncharacteristic, coming from the second princess, that he couldn't help but let his gaze linger on her face for a moment. A small, amused smile quirked about his mouth. Never? He asked. Aries didn't remove her eyes from the trees above them, but a similarly small smile came to her own lips just then. You forget, Lord Fulton. I'm used to the capital. One has to travel all the way to the outskirts of Palace before you see any true foliage, and even then, I dare say Asturias countrysides don't hold a candle to Fenalia's forests, not at this time of year, at least. Autumn was well under way, most of the leaves already having turned to reds and golds and burnished browns. In her sea blue ensemble she stuck out like a sore thumb, but Fulton found himself strangely charmed by the visual contrast. Or maybe it was that he found himself strangely charmed by her. It was true she was an attractive woman, not quite the obvious beauty that her sister was, but pretty all the same, and he'd always had some measure of respect for her, but this most recent visit had allowed him to get to know her in a way he'd never had a chance to before. She'd relaxed in the wake of the war. Her father's health hadn't made a complete turnaround, but it had improved, and the younger Princess Malerna seemed to be stepping up to meet her responsibilities as heir admirably. As a consequence, the icy armor that Aries had worn when he'd come to seek asylum had since melted into something more placid, if just as practical. It was an odd shift, though not an unwelcome one, and when she'd expressed a desire to tour the royal gardens, as the last time she had seen them had been over a decade ago, Vaughn hadn't even had to ask. Fulton had volunteered, right there on the spot. From there, they'd wandered onto the surrounding forest paths, and what had started as a leisurely way to while away some time following the midday meal had since turned into a full afternoon's walk. Fulton wasn't complaining, and as long as Aries was happy and the light held, he wasn't about to, either. It wasn't nearly as predictable as the leaves turning, nor as pleasant to walk through, I'm sure some would argue, but you should visit sometime in the winter, he said. Sometimes you'll get a bout of rain that will freeze overnight, and the trees look like they're literally covered in glass. And if you're lucky enough to have a breeze pass through, the corners of his mouth quirked up once more, then that's really something to hear. A little unsettling, perhaps, but musical in a way no instrument could ever be. Aries looked at him and smiled, the expression reaching her eyes and warming them. He hadn't quite been able to get her to laugh, but this was close. It sounds infinitely better than the occasional frozen salt spray we get in Palace, she said, and though it had hardly been the most formal of invitations, Fulton considered her words as good as acceptance as any.